Hi there. Welcome to Bible/Chat. Gus, hello.
John,
How are you?
I haven't been here for a while.
You haven't been here for a while.
That's
We've missed
true.
you. We've missed the banter, the interaction.
That's true.
The wisdom that you bring to the table.
Just, handing out pearls of wisdom like I do Tic Tacs.
Like Tic Tacs. You've been all over the world lately. You were in
Not
Dominican
all
Republic.
Not all over the world.
Dominican Republic. It looked beautiful.
Yeah.
Did you have a good time?
It was great.
Good. I'm glad.
We should talk about what's chat on that.
We should actually. It's all right. It's all right. We have a question that came up, so we want to answer it.
We had a question.
Yeah.
Was it a good question?
It was a good question. And they're always good questions. Go ahead. What's the question?
What up, Mr. Liars?
Stop, guys. No. Okay, go ahead. Come on.
So the question has to do with grounds for divorce.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So divorce and remarriage, it's a trending topic.
Yeah, trending, complex.
As the kids say.
As the kids say. Hot takes.
Hot takes. Yeah. It's a very, very difficult subject.
It's actually very complex.
So, and the question had to do with grounds for divorce, right? So, let me ask you first, what are some grounds for divorce, biblical grounds for divorce?
Yeah.
Not unbiblical.
Yeah. So there's really, in terms of grounds for divorce, there's really only one grounds for divorce that results in remarriage, that leaves an open door for remarriage. That is fornication. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is talking about marriage and divorce, and he says, some Pharisees come to him and they say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And Jesus actually says, it's actually the hardness of your hearts that made Moses give you the right to give a certificate of divorce. So he says, actually, divorce is not in God's mind initially. And we know that God hates divorce from the Old Testament. So you have this statement here where he says, like, it's actually because you guys are hard-hearted that Moses made grounds. And he made grounds to protect the mistreated party in that case. Then he says, in verse 9, he says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Okay, so that language is super important. There is this exception clause there. That exception clause, he says, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality. So the exception is immorality. And that word just means fornication in Greek. Yeah. So we're talking about an act of sexual violation of that union, that marriage covenant that exists between that man and that woman. There's a violation of that sexual union through some kind of fornication. And that act actually then turns into a grounds for divorce, a potential grounds for divorce. Now, we would never counsel that unless there's like a repeated act that way, or the person's been church disciplined, whatever.
Unrepentance.
Like gross unrepentance. Yeah. We wouldn't counsel that. We would actually counsel the opposite. We'd counsel forgiveness, patience. In fact, we would counsel forgiveness regardless of whether divorce were to take place there. Yeah. But Jesus leaves that exception open. And you can see the wisdom of that, because in the Old Testament, fornication was punishable by death. Yeah. So if a husband, for example, fornicated and his wife was left behind in that, then it wasn't an issue of divorce, because he was going to be put to death anyway. So she was going to be single whether she liked it or not. Even if she forgave him, she's still going to be single no matter what. So Jesus, because we're not living in a theocracy, he provides this caveat. So that's the one real grounds for divorce that results in remarriage. There's a second one in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 where you have the opportunity for divorce, but it doesn't allow for remarriage, and that's abandonment. Paul says, if you have a believer and an unbeliever married, and the unbeliever is willing to live with the believer, even if it's not a pleasant experience, if he or she is willing to live with the believer, they have to stay together. If the unbeliever says, I don't want to live with you anymore because you're a Christian, I don't want that, and they depart, the believer doesn't have to follow them. If that unbeliever says, I'm done with you, you're a Christian, I don't like that, I don't like Christianity, I'm moving to Texas, that believer doesn't have to say, no, I have to go with you, I can't be divorced. So they're actually freed to allow the divorce to take place. They're not free to remarry. Paul does not give that category. They're not free to remarry until that other person, the unbeliever, either marries or commits fornication in some capacity. That then frees them from that marriage covenant, which then allows them to remarry. And that's really it. Those are the only two ways that a believer can get divorced in a biblical way. Remarriage can only happen after fornication's taken place by the offending party.
Yeah, the question actually, as we were reading the question, had like a little spin to it, right?
Yeah.
The question said, well, this person has heard that something else that is trending nowadays is saying if there is even lust involved from one of the two not an actual act of fornication, but as Jesus says, someone who looks into a woman to lust after her, or a man to look lust after him, then it is like adultery. So this person was saying, would that be also grounds for divorce?
Yeah, and so that's two things are happening there. One is there's a gross misunderstanding of what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount when he says that, and then the second thing is it's a total misapplication to Matthew 19:9 to say that. In Matthew 5, when Jesus is talking about that, he's saying the law was not supposed to only constrain your external behavior. So what he's saying is a person who lusts in their heart has already committed adultery with that person in their mind. But he's not saying it's the equivalent of adultery, of course, because that doesn't actually make any sense. That would be the opposite of what's true. What he's saying is that adultery has already taken place in the mind. In other words, you're just as guilty for what you do inside as what you do outside. And there he's talking about guilt before God. But he's not saying that mental lust is the same as external adultery. That's a one-to-one. You can't say that. The guilt before God is true because that you've already moved toward that, and the only thing that's restraining you at that point is consequence. But that's still a restraint, right? So it's not the same sin. Those mental sins and external sins are not the same sin. They are the same. They come from the same root, but they're not the same sin. So that's just a misunderstanding of what Jesus is trying to do. And in fact, he does that with other things as well, right? He does that with anger. Anger isn't murder. We don't put people in jail for anger. Why? Because that's an internal sin. But he says, if you're angry, you've essentially killed your brother already, and the only thing that's restraining you is consequence. Well, those aren't a one-to-one, right? So we don't. When we read the Sermon on the Mount, we want to be careful to not import our own thoughts into that. Are we guilty when we sin in our hearts of the sin that we could have done on the outside except we were restrained? Of course we are. But does that mean that we've then done those sins? No, it doesn't. Which then we can take that over to Matthew 19:9 and say, no, in fact, Jesus uses a different word there. He uses that Greek word that means fornication, and he uses that word intentionally. It's not by accident. He uses that word intentionally because he wants to make it clear that it's not about the inner self in this case, it's about the external violation of that physical covenant that exists between the two who then become one flesh. You have to break that one flesh union through an act of fornication. And once that one flesh union is broken, then you have a situation where, okay, now it's been broken. Now divorce is permissible to go back to that text. So again, just a misunderstanding of actually both passages. And
that's not
a helpful.
That's super helpful to see that. I do think it's one of those things that has been... even with pornography, right? It's been, people have counseled others to say, well, that is the same thing, but it isn't a one-to-one. And even in Matthew 19, you see that there's a different word being used.
There's a word that's being used,
and it's by the same person, Jesus.
Right? Exactly. So, and what's interesting here too is that, pornography, addiction to pornography is evil. And it does have massive implications for a marriage. It causes so much devastation. But that doesn't need to be dealt with at the level of divorce. You want to deal with that at the level of church discipline. If you have a guy who's addicted to pornography, you want to start church discipline with that guy to help him, or girl, to help that person wrestle through that sin issue. And then perhaps to show that they're not actually a believer. If you see that repetitious act, then you say, I want to help you to see that you're not actually saved. That has nothing to do with their marriage status. If it becomes evident that they're not actually saved, we would still counsel that believer to stay with that unbeliever, right? To stay in that place with that unbeliever so that they are then obeying the command that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 7. We would never say divorce that person because they continue to do this sinful thing. In the same way that we wouldn't call someone to divorce a man who has maybe anger issues. It might be angry, might say things he shouldn't say, do all sorts of stuff like that. But that's not grounds for divorce because it's murder, right? It's not the same. So trying to tie those texts together in those kinds of ways is unhelpful. And I think usually is rooted more in issues of the person who's been offended, not really willing to seek forgiveness through that process.
That's helpful.
So,
thanks. That's really helpful.
Well, I hope that's helpful for you. If you have questions on that or any other topic, you can always email us at info@faithbibleoc.org. Thanks so much.